Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Cruisin' by Gerald Walker. Now, Cruisin' was published in 1970, and 10 years after this book was published, it was made into the William Friedkin film of the same name. Now, this edition of the book I have is actually the movie tie-in edition, because the cover here is actually one of the posters for the movie. Now, I've never seen the movie, but I know the movie was extremely controversial. I'm not sure if the book shared the same controversy when it was first published, but once again, I know the movie was extremely controversial, and I'll talk a little bit more about the film adaptation of this book at the end of this review. Now, I'm pretty sure the book is loosely based on a real-life series of murders that were occurring in the gay underground of New York City in the 1960s. Now, the detective who went undercover for this case, his name was Randy Jurgensen. I'm pretty sure I'm saying his last name right, and interestingly enough, he would actually go on to work as a technical consultant for several Hollywood films, including several of William Friedkin's films like The French Connection and, of course, Cruisin', which was the film adaptation of this book. Now, even though I still have not yet seen the film adaptation of this book, I do know that the movie was accused of being homophobic. Now, I'm not sure if the book was also accused of that, but I can see somebody reading this and thinking that the book is homophobic. Me personally, I don't think the book was intentionally homophobic, and I don't think it was intentionally hateful. However, I do think, being that this book was written in 1970, I do think that a lot of its views on homosexuality are definitely dated by today's standards. Now, the plot of Cruisin' is it's about this police officer named John Lynch who is sent undercover as a gay man to investigate this series of murders that have been happening in Greenwich Village, and all the victims have been young gay men. So, throughout the book, he's going to these various different gay bars, and he's really immersing himself in this world, and he's trying to pick up clues on who this killer could possibly be, and at the same time he's also sort of using himself as potential bait for this killer. The book also starts following the killer that Lynch is looking for, and you find out in the book that the killer is actually a self-loathing gay man who is killing other gay men because he hates his own sexuality. Now, in the book you find out that the killer also has sexual relationships with women, but I don't know if that's supposed to be because he's bisexual or he's just having these sexual relationships with women to sort of mask his true sexuality. And the book is very much a character study on both the protagonist and the antagonist. It's a character study on the character of John Lynch, and it really shows you how working on this case and going into this underground is sort of really affecting him psychologically, and it's also a character study on this demented serial killer. And throughout the novel, you really see the parallels between these two characters. Now, do I think the book is homophobic? Personally, I don't think the book is intentionally homophobic. Like, I'm sure if I went back in time and met Gerald Walker and asked him what his views on homosexuality are, I'm sure he would claim that he's not homophobic, but I'm sure if I actually analyzed what his views at the time were on homosexuality, I'm sure by today's standards they would hardly be considered progressive, but I don't think it was intentionally homophobic. But I do think a lot of the views on homosexuality in this book are definitely dated by today's standards. You gotta keep in mind that this book was published in 1970, and I'm pretty sure, and I could be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure we moved past the point where homosexuality was considered to be a mental illness, but that was only a few short years prior to this. So, of course, like a lot of the views on homosexuality in in this book are definitely dated by today's standards. And the majority of the gay characters in this book are very stereotypical. I'm not gonna lie, they are. And the character of John Lynch, who is arguably the protagonist of the novel, he is very much a homophobe, and he's very, very hateful towards homosexuals, and he really does resent the fact that he has to go undercover as a gay man. Now, while the main character of this book is homophobic, his homophobia is never looked at as a good thing, and he's also anti-Semitic, but his police captain is actually Jewish, and once again, his bigotry is never looked at as a good thing in this book. Now, the main character does eventually become friends with his neighbor, who is a gay writer, and I think this character is really important because while he is really the only positive gay character in the book, I think this character is important because he shows the main character of this book that this underground that he's living in is not representative of the entire gay community. And while Lynch doesn't fully overcome his prejudices towards gay people in this book, he still becomes genuinely fond of his neighbor and really does become friends with him. Now, the book does sort of imply that perhaps Lynch himself might actually be gay, and maybe the reason he's so hateful towards homosexuals is it could be like a self-loathing thing, very much like how the killer is a self-loathing gay man. Now, from what I've heard of the movie, apparently the movie touches on that idea way more than the book actually does. Now, where I think this book is very much dated is it does very much paint gay people as being so different from straight people. And of course, now we realize, or most people realize, that no, the majority of gay people out there are perfectly normal people, but this book very much paints them as being so different from the quote-unquote mainstream. And while I don't think Gerald Walker did this on purpose, it does sort of almost point a finger saying, look how different those people are. Now, to be fair, at the time this book was written, homosexuality was very much underground, but the only reason it was underground was because at the time it really wasn't accepted by the mainstream. Now, once again, I don't think the book was intentionally hateful towards gay people, but I do think it's easy from a 2017 perspective to look at this book, which was written in 1970, and accuse it of homophobia, but you really do have to look at the time period when this book was written and sort of look at it as a product of its time. Then again, I am saying this as a straight man. I'm sure if I was gay, I might have a completely different perspective on this book. Now, in the book, there does seem to be sort of a commentary on masculinity, because in the book there's a flashback to when John Lynch was a child, and you find out that one time when he was a child, he was hanging out with his uncle, who he really looked up to, and he was hanging out with his uncle's friends, and one of his uncle's friends was sort of berating him for not knowing how to swim, and this guy actually picked him up and threw him into this lake, and he was clearly drowned in, and his uncle refused to help him out of the lake because he felt like that wouldn't be manly enough. Like, he had to learn to swim by himself. Like, it was sort of this, like, macho bullshit, and the book does seem to have sort of a commentary on some of the negative aspects of masculinity. Now, as a book itself, I do think it's a solid little thriller. I think it's a solid crime drama slash psychological horror story, and I do recommend the book in that regard. Now, this book was adapted into the 1980 film of the same name, which was directed by William Friedkin, who also directed movies like The French Connection, The Exorcist, and Sorcerer. The movie also starred Al Pacino as the John Lynch character, even though I believe the character had a different name in the movie. Now, I know the movie is extremely controversial controversial and extremely polarizing. Like, I've heard people say that the movie is extremely hateful, and then I've heard people say that the movie is actually a little more progressive than it's given credit for. I've heard people say that the movie is an absolute mess, and then I've also heard other people say that the film is absolutely brilliant. Once again, I can't really judge on it myself because I still have not yet seen the movie. And the movie also had a lot of protesters. Even during the filming of the movie, there were a lot of protests, and apparently the protests got so bad that they actually couldn't use any of the audio for any of the scenes that were outside because you heard people yelling and screaming in the background. So apparently all the scenes that are shot outside in Cruising are actually all dubbed. And unfortunately, there were some actual hate crimes that were inspired by the movie. There was also a 2013 film entitled Interior Leather Bar, which was co-directed by James Franco, which I've never seen this movie, but apparently it's supposed to be, like, very loosely based on the making of Cruising. But yeah, that was my review on Cruising by Gerald Walker, and bye.